All right, last chapter, last section. So what we would consider to be chapter 4B. We start off with the church in the pews of the modern church, and we wrap up this book. Okay, good thing, bad thing. I like the fact that we're not, in this big gigantic hardback history book that we're studying for what feels like months. So a survey class, especially for something like history, I think is a way for us to hit high points that are interesting, tell some stories, give some context, and then always allow for further interest to be explored at your convenience. Bad thing, this book is so short that we're hitting, 300, 400 years of pop. That's a long time, man. That's a lot of ground to cover. This modern era, as we mentioned last week, covers the Enlightenment, the Industrial Revolution. It covers, all of the 20th century, basically into postmodernity, into contemporary times. That is so much ground to cover and so radically different. Yes.
And it seems like it's changing more rapidly.
Well, and our
Fieldwork.
our technical innovations are very obviously changing with what seems almost like an exponential change. Stuff that it took, a generation to change, then it took 10 years, and then it took 5 years, and now it takes months or whatever. But what's the name of that? It's an algorithm, and it's named after somebody, so-and-so's formula. And I think he did this like in the 70s, and it was about the doubling of processor speed in a computer chip it's going to happen like every year or 2 years, whatever it is. And it's actually it's held, amazingly well. But when you think about that, that's not an exponential growth. That's a geometric growth. When something doubles over a set period of time, a consistent set period of time. But when you think about that, doubling, when you do that multiple times, you get to really big numbers way faster than you think. Here's a practical way to do it. I believe, it's something really silly. Like, if the entire world, all 8 billion people or whatever, started a game of rock, paper, scissors, one-on-one, it's something like we would only need like 16 rounds or 18 rounds or whatever to crown a world champion. And that seems unbelievable. 8 billion people. But when you start cutting that in half, and that half in half, and that half of a half in half, and that half of a half of a half in half, and suddenly it just accelerates so fast. And so these technological innovations, which change so incredibly rapidly, I think can't help but change how we relate, how we work, how we think. I'm quite convinced it has not changed our nature. Humans are humans, and that's the way we are. And you could pull out somebody from the 1300s, and they would be almost incapable of doing anything with the changes in the world and the language and the technology and everything like that. But I think it's a matter of, do they love their children? Are they tempted to steal what they like? Things like that, I don't think they've ever changed. And I don't think they ever will, because I think that's how we are. It's who we are. And that's one of the useful things to remember. And I'll put this back in the context of church history and what we're talking about now in modernity. Our nations, our governments, our economies, they can be extremely different. They can be very antagonistic, but the people who live within those nations and economies and systems, I'm pretty sure are just people. People are people. And anyway, that is a lot to try to cover, because as I mentioned in the time frame, if COVID had happened even 5 years before, we could not have done the online presence that we did. Just the software and the hardware required to do that would have been so much more expensive and so much more difficult to use and probably less reliable. You know, the concept of on the fly switching to a live stream. We literally went from one Sunday we were in person. It was the fourth Sunday in Lent of 2020. And the very next Sunday, we were live streamed on the computer. And you know, the live stream, we improved it a lot over a short period of time. We got better hardware and software, and we learned how to do a few things differently and all that. But just the fact that we could do it at all, and the fact that we could do it, we could flip that in 1 week. We never lost a Sunday as far as, you know, we're closed. And that happened in other places. And, you know, again, if this happened in 2015, I don't know what we do. We probably would have recorded something and uploaded it. We could have done that. And, you know, that would have been something. If this happened in 2010, I'm not even sure we could have done that. So this absolutely covers such an enormous period of time. But that's kind of one of the limitations. So I was saying good thing, bad thing. The limitations, it goes so fast. And I'm going to get to the second limitation, which is it's extremely Roman Catholic at the end. It's always kind of fudged a little here and there, but especially in this section, the last 300 years, and the gist of it is the Catholic social movement. I just think that misses, oh, I don't know, the Great Awakening and the Second Great Awakening. It misses all of the post-war Protestant boom. It misses, you know, the founding of the Episcopal Church. You know, the national Protestant churches moving from being kind of connected to the king to having more of a cultural identity, to the liturgical reformation of the 20th century. And these are some of the things that I want to talk about, because I don't want to gloss over the book, but I think the book got real narrow right at the end, which it's not unimportant, but I think there's a lot of ground that we can touch on even quickly, just to sort of fill those gaps a little bit.
To the Catholics, it was.
Right, like that's what was important to them. I will say, I thought even Vatican II got very brief mention in that, and I thought like they were going to get into it with a little more depth, and they just sort of pass over it. But let's go in context. I'm going to bounce around just a little bit, because you know, Vatican II is brought up, and one of the hallmarks that this guy mentions about this modern era, which I think is very good and it's very appropriate across the board, is the rise of the laity. And that was, you know, very significant part of Vatican II. More lay engagement, more lay involvement, more lay authority. I never grew up with Father Knows Best. I will say though, growing up as a child, I had one rector from my birth until I was in college, and we never said Father Knows Best, but we never crossed him. You know, like whatever he said kind of went, and that was just the way it was.
It was understood.
It was just understood. Nobody had to say, you know, this was the system. Now, later on, that same parish, years later, got a new rector who was a former Roman priest, who was very schooled, like he was an Irish, Boston Irish, and he was very much a father, like he would tell you, Father Knows Best, and it was a very like, that's all there is to it, and you're gonna, because I said so. And you know, maybe there was more overlap between the two, but one really stood out, like, maybe because it's just so explicit. So that seems very noteworthy because I think our assumptions have changed over the decades. And that's happened through a lot of sources, but this concept of the laity, and it would have been unthinkable for, 500 years ago, lay people in the pews to sit on the sort of vestry that we have that's making financial decisions and hiring and firing, and this is what's going to happen on the property, and this is what, that kind of collaborative effort through the various, through the various types of ministry. I mean, it just didn't happen. And so we're seeing some of this Enlightenment application, like we talked about last week, the dignity of each person, the authority, the self-determination of each person. And as that filters through the structure of the church, the daily workings of the church, that's where the laity begin to have a higher expectation. I ought to be involved. Why wouldn't I be involved? That's going to be really great for lay ministries, because now, it's not just the guy in the collar doing stuff on our behalf, but we are very, very seriously taking our own ministry and missions, priesthood of all believers and baptismal covenants and all that kind of stuff, that I have a personal responsibility and stake, not just in my own working out my own salvation with fear and trembling, but going out and doing the work of the church, the work of Christ in the world, with my neighbors, in my workplace, with my families. And pardon? Holding up our end, but even just realizing there is an end for us to hold. And so a lot of that modern era has been exemplified through not just the presence and the great growth of lay ministry, but really a complete change in expectation. It almost seems redundant to call it lay ministry, but there's just ministry that gets done, right? I've got lots of gray hair, but when I went to seminary, we were reminded very explicitly that in the orders of ministry, the laity was supposed to be on top and the bishops were at the bottom, that it wasn't a hierarchy pyramid like this, it was a hierarchy pyramid like that. Because they not only outnumber us as far as the orders of ministry, like every order of ministry, the deacons and the priests, and you get fewer of them, but the responsibility predates each one. You have a responsibility as a disciple of Jesus or through your baptismal covenant before you take any other responsibilities in the ordination of a priest or a deacon or a bishop. We were also told very explicitly, once a deacon, always a deacon. So the deacons aren't junior varsity priests, but it's just a different ministry of which you're supposed to take the good from that and always use it. And then you have something else added on top of it. And that every one of us was a part of the laity. So laity, laos, from the Greek, means the people. Once you are ordained, you don't stop being the people, is what, you don't become a different creature or being, is what we were reminded. Well, but that's just it. Like, through a lot of the church, that was kind of the practical outgrowth, right? Was that the priests and the deacons and the bishops and the archbishops and the cardinals and the popes and everything else, they were no longer, they were here and the laity was here. They were different. And whether it was cooperative and collaborative or not, they were different, and they were distinctly different. It's pretty revolutionary then to be reminded of something which I think was always true, and I think it wasn't always the other way. I think there have been times in church history, and certainly the early church had a much less codified system in place. That has to grow over time. They were small. It was very organic in that sense. And I'm not saying it's because, they had it right and we all had it wrong. It's just more like you don't even have enough time to set up a system yet. But systems are very important because we're not trying to live for today. We are, we have things in place so that we can teach our children the faith and they can teach their children the faith, and we can continue to spread the word and all this kind of stuff that needs, a way to be maintained as well as propagated. So anyway, that is all these things are interconnected, the Enlightenment and there's also a period of renewed scholarship and scholarly interest, rediscoveries of writings of the church fathers in the early church. So let's give you a for instance, and we're going to make it a prayer book, an Episcopal prayer book, for instance. What is referred to as the liturgical reform movement happens in kind of the early mid 20th century. And a lot of that has to do with archaeological finds and scholarly rediscoveries of stuff that the Protestant reformers did not have access to. So, for instance, Thomas Cranmer is writing the first Book of Common Prayer in the mid 1500s, and he is using the best sources he has to come up with a connection to the early church, the apostolic age, the structure of things and the certain types of prayers, and there is a legitimate effort to say this book, these are common prayers that we will all say, all of us together, because they reflect the legacy of the church. Like, this is kind of the way the church has always prayed, and we stand in that continuation. We're doing it in a different language, our language. We are doing it with a slightly different format that we received, because over the centuries, we're going to say that, Rome has started to add a bunch of stuff to it and start veering off in certain directions. So we're going to pare some of that off. We're going to simplify it. We're going to, try to hearken back to older forms or whatever. And there was a real desire in the Protestant Reformation of writing these liturgies, having these services that were kind of back to basics, recovery of the early church. Well, the practical problem was, they knew less about the early church in the 1600s than we learned in the subsequent centuries. So as they started digging and finding stuff, as they started researching and studying and translating, they found a little more all the time. And so if your best source, for instance, what does a church service look like around the year 120? If your best source is something that comes from the year 500, well, that's pretty good, especially as ancient sources are concerned. Ancient sources are hard to come by. So, a couple 300 years, that's, you're getting pretty close to the bullseye. Well, what happens when they start uncovering fragments and documents that actually date from that time period? Whoa. Well, now we can start saying we were guessing it looked like this, and now we have something to compare to. Whether or not everybody prayed in the way that is recorded in Hippolytus, having documents that were now from the early 2nd century that talked about the church service, that talked about these are the prayers that were said, that talked about this is how we organized our scripture readings, that talked about this is what we did with communion. Well, suddenly it went from our best guess and our best resource at the time to new resources that were even older and even better. So that is also in combination with this sense of the Enlightenment and the dignity of every person and the self-determination and authority and all that kind of stuff, because we are hearkening back to a time where the church was less formally organized and the lay people were super involved. And again, I'm calling them lay people, but we are all lay people. Even in the New Testament, it is super difficult to say this is exactly what a presbyteros, a presbyter, an elder did, versus an episkopos, an overseer. They seem to be somewhat interchangeable. So now that gets changed in early church tradition. The presbyteros, the presbyter, the elder, the priest starts functioning underneath the overseer, episkopos, bishop. But early on, it was kind of, I'm not exactly sure where to draw the line. So we have a lot of things that, these overarching things that are making a difference to us in the pews. If it's changing our perspective on what's my involvement, what's my stake, what's my responsibility, ministry being recovered for all the people at all the times and all of their various personal circumstances, rather than just the clergy caste on top doing all the ministry or accomplishing it for you. Even that becomes super kind of complicated. I am not old enough to remember ad orientem as anything other than something I read about. But if you go to even an Episcopal church that's old enough, you will find an altar that's up against the wall. Why? Because the priest celebrated ad orientem facing the east. That's where the sun rises, where morning comes. It's very resurrection oriented. And so everyone would face the east for a lot of the service. And that kind of grows from a very Roman Catholic tradition. And you know, you might have been to churches, you might have grown up in a church that did that. There's at least a couple of churches in our diocese that had a church up against, I think they still do. I don't think they use it, but I think they still do. Like, that's the old altar, but we've got a new one. And there was a process where they were pulling them off the wall, and oh, it's a big deal. We're now facing the people. So we have people now, though, who are saying maybe we ought to face to the east again, because we've turned to face the people to become more familiar and intimate, as though we were gathered together. But is there the unintended consequence that makes me more like an MC or a game show host, rather than one of the people? Because if we all face in the same direction, we are all praying to God together. I'm not higher than you or above you, because we all face it. Like, ooh, now we've got this argument that's like, okay, that's a fair point. So it becomes kind of complicated. And these are issues and complications that are getting worked out, not in ecumenical councils. They're getting worked out at every church building that comes together. You know, TBA across the street does their church service differently than we do. And how did they come up with that? They just did. The Church of Christ up the street. Now, maybe they have a Church of Christ seminary where they say a Church of Christ service ought to look like so-and-so. But, you know, not just the non-denominational churches, but almost every church has sort of taken it upon themselves to interpret within their context how they are going to be this living example of the faith once received. 500 years ago, 1,000 years ago, that was unthinkable. Not because it was, oh, what blasphemy. I'm just saying it wouldn't even enter the people's minds. That wouldn't have been a question they ever had to come up with.
Not my job.
Yeah, like what do you know, you're asking me something that I don't even understand why you're asking me that question. That has nothing to do with me. So, but all of these overarching things that we've been talking about are becoming evident within the life of the individual Christian and the life of the individual congregation. So the term Catholic means kind of a combination of universal and comprehensive. You know, the lower C Catholic is supposed to intend, like, this is the faith that is universal. It's good all times, all places, every tribe, tongue, language, nation. And it's comprehensive, meaning it's everything that you need. It you know, throughout your life and throughout human history, it's all the faith that is delivered from the saints that we require, that God wants of us. So Catholicity becomes exceptionally difficult to see in practice when every congregation is sort of, I'm not going to say they're making it up as they go, but they're kind of shaping it to the way it makes sense to them. I'm not arguing that as a bad point. I'm just saying that is the way it is. And we can take a very, in the East, it's a little different, but like your Roman Catholic parishes, we have 3 in town, like in Lakeland itself, or within our rough area, I think 3. And if we start expanding, we get several more. I got to tell you, going to a service at John Newman does not look like a service at St. Joseph's downtown.
Not at all.
Sorry.
Mm.
And that, oh, the Roman Catholic liturgy. They don't look the same. I'm not saying they're night and day different, but you 100% get this church's take on the environment, the atmosphere, and a different church's take on the environment and atmosphere. Yeah.
May I tell you that when you went to the Union Church, I was there, and there were Catholics that were wondering, wow. They couldn't believe that the kinds of things you could talk about were talk aboutable in the church. And they were all so impressed, and they put some pressure on the own priest.
You know, at our church, I consider myself a pretty middle of the road liturgical Episcopal priest. Like, I'm a prayer book priest. I'm a Rite 2 guy. I mean, I like Rite 1, but I'm just saying, like, I'm not creating my liturgies from ad hoc. That's why we don't print full bulletins, believe it or not, because I want you to have the prayer book in your hands. And I think there's some value in following what the prayer book says and then flipping around and seeing the other things that it offers. We have our quirks, some that I received, some that I brought along with me, and things that would make even a pretty straightforward Rite 2 prayer A service look a little different than it would look, you know, say in my home church in Orlando, or at the cathedral, or at Grace Ocala, whatever. We have 2 services. The liturgy is almost identical. Very slight variation. They feel very different. The buildings are different. The music is different. What you see around you is different. The holding a prayer book versus seeing the slides projected. I mean, it's different. And even saying the same words has kind of this different feel. Again, these were sort of unthinkable 1,000 years ago. And I think this is, when we want to talk about the modern era, this is kind of the outgrowth of it in a way that we perceive as the people in the pews. Every church making some choices. Now, maybe those choices are very bounded. You know, the difference between John Newman and St. Joseph's, as different as they are still way more similar to each other than they are at the HB Church.
Oh, yeah.
So they're bounded maybe by your denomination. They're bounded maybe by your location in the world. But even within those boundaries, we are making choices about the music that we pick, the church architecture that we see around us. That's no longer imposed from the top universally, but it is almost literally one single congregation at a time making these decisions and then being shaped in a way that they say, this is the faith once received by the saints. This is the apostolic faith. This is the faith of the Bible and the early church and everything else. But this is how it's expressed right here and right now. And a lot of that is going to, be dovetailing what I mentioned before about this liturgical renewal movement of the mid-20th century. As they're recovering these documents, as they're saying, oh, there's stuff we didn't know about or we didn't realize, or a lot of that is reflected in our 79 prayer book. So a lot of the things that are being discovered are either referenced pretty directly, or it's an application like, oh, because I saw this, I'm going to write prayers that kind of look like that, even though we're writing them today, but they're modeled after this thing that we found from the early 2nd century. So you start getting finding these early works, Shepherd of Hermas, and Hippolytus is a big one, writings from Irenaeus. And they're starting to give these context clues, and sometimes fuller liturgies. Again, this is in the West. The East preserved their liturgies a lot better than we did. To some degree, like frozen in amber kind of preservation, but regardless, my friend, the Orthodox Archbishop, really liked our baptismal service, and he really liked Eucharistic prayer D. He liked D because it was so long. D is the interstellar space and galaxies and this fragile earth, our island home, the Star Wars prayer. He liked D, not because he thought that the theology was spot on, but because it seemed like it was trying harder because it was longer. They used the liturgy is like the liturgy of St. Thomas or something like that, and never say in a sentence which you can take 3 paragraphs to say. So it's super redundant. It goes into all sorts of repetitive detail, and then you're constantly kissing things. I was very blessed to be allowed to participate in their in the divine service on a few occasions, special occasions, but a few. And I was kind of serving the job as like a deacon or a subdeacon or something. But there's all these things that happen and bells that ring and doors that open and prayers that take forever to say because you say the same thing 20 times. But then I was constantly being handed stuff to kiss. Now kiss this. Now kiss that. Now take this square and kiss each of the 4 corners. And it was just like, it was this constant barrage of activity that was so radically different, even though there was a lot of overlap between what we were saying and what they were doing. But it's almost like we were the stripped down quickie version of this fuller thing that happened. And one of the best expressions of this in our prayer book is the Great Easter Vigil. The Great Easter Vigil follows the service that's the oldest existing liturgy we have. So it comes from the documents we're using to prepare this are 2nd century documents of Feast of the Resurrection and the service of the catechumens. So basically you would be catechized all year long, and then you would get baptized and receive your first communion on Easter morning. And so we preserve these elements of it, but we kind of shorten it, we summarize it. We have this long section in the front called the History of Salvation. And we do like, I think 3 Old Testament readings. The prayer book, I think it's like 9. It's a bunch. And it starts in Genesis and it goes, blah, 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 blah. And they're not super long, but it's telling, there's a line in the liturgy. This is like, now we will hear about God's work in human history for salvation or something like that. And then it goes through all this stuff. In the recovered ancient documents, they started this service at like midnight and they weren't finishing until dawn. And that was all on purpose. And so they had to read that much of the Old Testament in order to take up all this time. And we have then received like, oh, okay, so at the Great Easter Vigil, we should have extra Old Testament readings that kind of correspond to hearing how God has been working out salvation from the beginning. We're going to get the historical stuff. We're going to get some prophets in there and on and on. But maybe we shouldn't take 6 hours to do it. Instead of 6 hours, let's just do 6 readings. Because people will probably do that, but they won't do 6 hours. And so again, that's what we do. We start in the dark, and then it's light. That's the rubrics that suggest this. And that's preserving something that, again, it would go all night long. The structure of the prayers, the structure of the service, patterned and modeled after stuff that we found that 2nd century Christians were doing. Now, can we say definitively that every 2nd century Christian did that exactly? No. But we do have evidence that some of them did. And because it's a sort of evidence that seemed authoritative, the odds are pretty good that it looked like that for everybody or most people. You don't tend to save the one-off stuff. You preserve the things that are important because they're ubiquitous or they're everywhere. So the 79 prayer book was trying to update the Book of Common Prayer, which had been going on since the mid 1500s. And every time it was revised very modestly. A few language changes, a little bit of reorganization. The first American prayer book had to take out all the God Save the King stuff. But if you put side by side Cranmer's prayer book and the 1928 American prayer book, they flow very similarly. Very similar. There's differences. And beyond the God Save the King stuff, there are real differences, but it feels like a very clear continuation. The 79 prayer book and the 28 prayer book are very different. They're structured differently. They've got different stuff in them. And again, I am not old enough to remember morning prayer as the expected Sunday service, but there, you guys might, and there was certainly a time in the Episcopal Church of the 20th century where morning prayer was still, depending on your part of the country, morning prayer was the expected Sunday service, and communion was monthly, quarterly, special occasions, something like that. We will occasionally get someone from like the West Indies, and they might have grown up with this very, very long Sunday service. And what would, in essence, what an older person might call matins, but they would start off with morning prayer, do that whole service, and then do the whole Eucharistic service. And that's how it all flowed. So our experience in the pews then, say, just talk about the Episcopal Church for a second. It used to be that your region of the country would heavily influence what the service looked like. That really isn't the case anymore. Now, I'm not going to say that there aren't places or pockets that still have these like peculiar quirks. But part of this is the technology. We're able to communicate instantly with people all over the country. People are able to travel whenever they want, and they can go from here to there, in such a short period of time that there's just kind of a transient culture. So part of what that does is it kind of homogenizes things in the sense of, I remember hearing tales about, oh, he's Snake Belly Low, Virginia Episcopal. Like, I don't even know what that means. And I'm not sure that even exists anymore. It's more of a historical artifact, because even though you go to a different church, like if you're somebody who travels across the country, or you have traveled across the country, and you make it a point, oh, it's Sunday, let me find a local church. You are going to find it's different than where you went before, but there's also a lot of commonality to it. You're actually less likely to go to an Episcopal church somewhere else right now and it to feel like shockingly different. It's more likely to be like, I don't recognize these prayers. What is this, from the New Zealand prayer book? Father Scott was a little notorious in the office for giving Priscilla that Sunday's printed bulletin to print and to fold, because he was pulling, this prayer is from the Kenyan prayer book, and this prayer is from Common Worship, and this prayer is from, whatever. I found this cool prayer. And then she would print it out, and then he would have a flash of inspiration on Saturday. And he would come in early on Sunday and reprint them and refold them. So you can legitimately go places and be like, I don't recognize this prayer, but it's not because I'm in the Pacific Northwest. It's because I'm in that specific congregation. That priest, that congregation, or whatever might have their own little idiosyncrasies, but it's not like, oh, well, here in New England, we all do such and such. Nope. It's all kind of just sort of spread out.
It's a big fruit bowl.
It is a big fruit bowl, full of fruits. That's a very true statement. So this is, kind of where we are summing things up. He made a nice line about it's hard to describe the effects of the modern period because we are currently in the midst of that history. It's not been written because we're doing it now. So there are things that we can reflect on the past, that 200 years ago and the more recent past. I think there are trends that we can describe or try to extrapolate what may come next. But I think he is right that there's a lot to be determined. There's a lot to be determined about these changes, and if they were good changes, the term progress gets kicked around a lot as though it were self-evident. And to go back to my C.S. Lewis, he was the one who said that the true progressive is the person who realizes they're going in the wrong direction and turns around and goes in the right way. So are there things that we do or things that we take for granted that maybe weren't in our best interest? Another phrase that's rather popular these days is about the judgment of history, or what they put it some way on social media, but that's basically the idea. Like, we're making these decisions because history later is going to view us in a certain way. Nobody wants to think that they are going to be the people yelling and screaming at the children who are being led into a newly integrated school by the National Guard. But at the time, those people who were doing the yelling and the screaming thought they were in the right. You go a few decades later and all of us look at that and like, oh my gosh, what about us that we either think is completely correct or we just don't even bother to question, we're wrong about it. We've turned the wrong way, or we've done the wrong thing, or we haven't thought it through well enough, or I don't know.
Well, I mean, you can give up some things just so far.
Yeah.
And at some point you have to say no.
And no further. Sure. Yeah. There's Luther for you. Here I stand and I will go no further. We live in this double-edged time of the incredible ease of access of Scripture. We have more Bibles, more access to the Word of God than has ever existed in all of human history. Not only do we have so many Bibles on this property that you don't even know where they are because they're swirled away underneath stuff and in boxes. We have so many, and people will just donate them to us. Like, I don't even want this. We have so many. But all of us carry this magical device where we can call up not just a Bible, we can have it cross-translated in multiple English versions and in multiple languages. We can get it to cross-reference stuff. It's amazing. We have tools in an instant that the monastic scholars did not accrue over a lifetime of study. But we are, for the riches of our resources, we are so much dumber because we don't have to know anything. We can just Google it. Are kids better on their times tables today than they were 30 years ago? Nope. They're substantially worse. Why? Because you don't need it. You're not always going to have a calculator with you. Actually, I think I might. The amazing ease, the overabundance, even the ridiculous riches of biblical scholarship and content that we have at any moment, any time, is a little bit like always looking up on Google the answer to things, but having none of the discipline behind it to understand the context. Periodically, I'll talk about the different phases of knowledge, about how we have the data, and then we have knowledge, and then we have wisdom. And data is like raw information. That's like Googling something. What is the average rainfall of the Amazon basin, and you Google it and it gives you this, it spits out a number. And that number may be true, but you don't really understand anything about it. Is that a lot? Is that a little? Is it more than it used to be? Is it about the same? What are the effects of that? How does it happen? Why does it happen? All of those things are then in knowledge, where you have gained the context to be able to interpret and understand that raw bit of data or information. What does it mean? How do you use it? What's the purpose and the big deal? And then finally, wisdom would be that last step of then applying that knowledge rightly and doing it so many times that you can now become reliable in your understanding. We just look stuff up, we get our answer, and then we walk away, and we miss so much that before you could look it up easily and you had to really research it, you learned so much more. But because now it's all at our fingertips, we use it less. It's so easy. There's another a sermon quotation from a few weeks ago when I did the Thomas Paine about that which we obtain too cheaply, we esteem too lightly. And he's talking about freedom and liberty of the American Revolution. It's worth the fight. It's worth the sacrifice. You should expect it to be hard because it's valuable. Data and information to us is as cheap as dirt because it's everywhere. And therefore, it's like, meh. Our Bibles. You know, I had a Bible that I underlined and I highlighted. And when I was in high school, I couldn't afford a rainbow Bible, which was a new thing. So I did my own. I got multiple different colors of highlighters and I came up with a system like, oh, the prophetic statements of Jesus are going to be in blue, and the, you know, words about salvation, I'm going to write, I'm going to highlight that in green. And, you know, and I started going through this thing and I learned so much because I was so in depth with it. I was reading it cover to cover and I was trying to categorize it and explain it and relate it to other passages. And now, and I haven't done that in years, I don't have to. I can call up on my phone and I can say, give me a passage on XYZ, and then cross-reference it with two more passages from, give me one from the Old Testament, one from the, it just does it. The answer is there, but because I didn't have to work to get to it, I'm a little weaker and flabbier in my mind and in my spirit. So if there's something to be said about the people in the pews, I would say we have this incredible abundance of opportunity and riches amongst us. Scripture is everywhere. You have ministries that you can be involved in without any kind of ordination or seminary training. You can go anywhere you want and find a place that kind of reflects your temperament, your personality, your predilections. And in the midst of this abundance, people do less. They go to church less. They read their Bibles less.
Know what's happening there.
You know, it is a conundrum and a paradox and all sorts of other stuff. I'm not going to say it's bad that we have all this. I think these are blessings. It's God's graciousness, this abundance. But what we've done with it has definitely been pretty mixed.
Well, we've taken it for granted.
Very much so. And that is the eternal human struggle, is it not? That we work and strive to attain, and then once we do, we take it for granted. And we either lose it altogether, or we lose the good of it that we used to have and that we've tried so hard to get. So I would say that's where we are. We're summing everything up. We live in a marvelous, amazing time where the people in the pews have every advantage, every resource, every blessing, every benefit right there in front of us. What we do with that, however, how it relates to our unchanging human nature, I fear is a really mixed bag. Rather than becoming the most knowledgeable of scripture generation in human history, I think we don't know anywhere near as much as we used to. So we take our freedoms, we make our choices, But that is the church we live in these days. Freedom and choices. Both of those things I'm going to argue are good. But they do come with consequence. And before we had the freedom and before we had the choice, and we just kind of took what we got.
I grew up in the church of Father Says.
Yeah. It is what it is, right? So as we stand on the shoulders of giants, as we receive the faith that was passed along from the saints of old, as we are, united in a single body of Christ that stretches throughout time and space and every tribe, language, tongue, and nation, and deep in the past and on into eternity, we have this unique position of time right here, right now, because that's all we're given. And I would say our struggle is going to be, what do we do with the blessings that we have received? And how can we use them rightly and well? We live in a time in the church where amazing and miraculous things can happen and still do happen. But history is not being written, by some outside external force. It's us. We're writing it as we're doing stuff today. We're a part of making it happen. And this is what is our challenge of discipleship as the people of the pews today. That's going to be different than it was in the past, but this is, they had their challenges and we have ours. And I would say this one is ours. With the freedom and the choice, what will you do with it in order to be a faithful disciple of Jesus today? Anything else? That's a lot of stuff. Anything, just, stray thoughts, concluding sentiments? This will be our last one on this, and then we will start. I do not have an immediate backup, but I'm working on it. I've been trying to accrue different things, and I don't feel super confident. But there will be a next time for sure. But anything else on our Church History 101? All right. Well, thank you all, whether you were here live or watching it. I appreciate it. It was fast. It was drinking from a fire hose, but hopefully there was something good that we can take from this, that we truly do stand in the line of saints, as difficult as that may be. So may God continue to lead us forward to him.